So, welcome everybody to today's webinar, Building Your First Endowment, What Every Nonprofit Should Know. I'm your host, Megan Lankowski, and I'm part of the nonprofit team here at Carnegie. So, have you ever asked yourself something like, could we ever actually start an endowment, or is that only for big universities and hospitals? If you have asked yourself that, you're not alone because lots of organizations have. Or maybe your board has asked something like, are we too small for something like that? Do we even have the right donors or infrastructure? What would it take to manage that? Well, these are all the kinds of questions that we're going to be walking through today. I've worked with a lot of nonprofits, both big and small, and I know that just saying the word endowment can make it feel like we're talking about something that's really out of reach, especially for small and mid-sized organizations. But and I say that because that's how I felt when I was a development director at a domestic violence shelter here in Northeast Ohio. Every year, we were barely getting by with covering just our operating budget. So the thought of setting extra money aside or building towards an endowment just didn't feel realistic. But the reality is that any size nonprofit can build an endowment. And that's what we're here to show you today. Oh, so you're in the right place. Don't worry. So here's a couple things that we're going to be going over today. We're going to start by clarifying what are the different types of endowments, including one that your board can create on its own without needing one big major donor. We'll tackle some of the common questions and misconceptions. After that, we will shift to UPMIFA, and I know that can sound intimidating. We will go over exactly what that is and actually give you some follow-up resources that you can dig in a little bit deeper to on your own as well. We're also going to go over the practical side of what it takes to manage an endowment well and responsibly, and also go over the accounting basics and common mistakes to avoid. Finally, then we'll wrap up with a clear breakdown of what to do when you're ready to get started. And then follow up at the end with some Q&A. So our goal today here is simple. We want to help you explore whether an endowment fits your nonprofit's long-term sustainability strategy and really understand what it would take to manage that responsibly. We are not going to be diving into fundraising strategy today. The questions of how to actually fund your endowment find that seed money, we're going to be covering that in our next session on August 20th. So make sure to keep an eye on your inbox. We'll give a plug at the end as well, because in that session, we'll walk through both quasi endowments and donor designated endowments and give you some real ideas on how you can start making progress towards those goals. But today is really about focusing on the basics so you can begin the right conversations with your key stakeholders, so that you're able to put those building blocks in place, because that is really essential to start off and build your long-term sustainability the right way. So before we dive in, just a couple quick housekeeping notes. First, yes, the webinar is being recorded, so you don't need to take furious notes. We'll email the recording to everyone who is registered. Second, we'll have some Q&A time at the end, so feel free to drop in your questions in the Q&A or chat panel, and we'll make sure to get to them at the end. And yes, this dog is living the life that I want to be today in this hot Cleveland weather. But since we are not diving into the pool right now, let's dive into some insights that you can really take home and to help your organization thrive. So a quick overview of who Carnegie is and why we're hosting this conversation today. Carnegie is a registered investment advisor, which means we are fiduciaries. Simply put, that means that we are legally and ethically required to put our clients' interests first always. And that matters a lot, especially when you're managing charitable funds meant to support your mission long term. And not everybody is required. So asking the people that you're working with if they are fiduciaries is a great place to start. We're headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, and we work with nonprofits all over the country. We manage about $6.5 billion in assets for individuals, institutions, and organizations like yours. But really, what makes our team different is that we go beyond just managing investments. We help nonprofits think strategically about their financial future, and we offer tools like this webinar to support your fundraising efforts and long term strategy. We are also very excited to partner with Smith CPAs and Associates today. Smith CPAs and Associates is a full service accounting firm specializing in the nonprofit industry. They're based in Southern Florida and they offer tailored financial services, including bookkeeping, audit reviews, grant compliance, tax compliance, and strategic CFO advisory services. With a strong commitment to integrity, scalability, and transparency, Smith CPAs helps mission-driven organizations build sustainable financial practices that support your long-term impact. And we're so excited to have Sean on the call today to share his insights. So who are you going to be hearing from today? Well, you've already been hearing from me. I'm your host, Megan Linkoski. I'm Carnegie's nonprofit development specialist. I've spent the last 12 years in the nonprofit world, primarily in fundraising and development, helping organizations grow their revenue and make a bigger impact. You'll also be hearing from Chris Carey, Vice President and Portfolio Manager at Carnegie. Chris specializes in building and managing investment portfolios for individuals and nonprofit organizations. With a deep understanding of financial markets and the nonprofit sector, he provides strategic guidance to help organizations achieve their long-term financial goals. And our esteemed partner today is Sean Smith, who will also be sharing his expertise with you. Sean is managing partner at Smith CPAs and Associates, and he specializes in nonprofits and service-based industries. With over a decade of experience in public accounting and financial advisory services, he leads with a focus on compliance, strategic tax planning, and personalized financial guidance. All right, that is enough from me, and let's make sure that everybody is paying attention. Now that all the housekeeping's done, because this is the meat of that we're going to get into. And I'm going to hand it over to Chris. Let's start off with the basics of what is actually an endowment.
Thank you, Megan. So, great place to start. And at its core, an endowment is a pool of funds that your nonprofit sets aside, not for this year or for next year, but to support the mission over the long term. I like to think of it as planting a tree. You nurture it now, and over time, it starts to bear fruit year after year. That fruit, or income, can help fund your programs, stabilize finances, and give you more breathing room when fundraising ebbs and flows. Now, unlike a reserve fund that you might dip into for short-term needs or emergencies, an endowment is built to last. It's typically invested, and depending on the type, there are often rules on how much you can spend and when. But the big idea is that you're building something durable, something that continues to serve your mission long after the initial gift or contribution is made. And it doesn't have to be big right away. In fact, most endowments start small and grow over time, which we'll talk about more in a bit. So let's delineate between a reserve fund and an endowment. A reserve fund is like your safety net. You're not subjecting these funds to stock market volatility, usually just owning cash, money markets, and maybe some ultra short-term US treasuries. It's meant to be it's meant for short to medium term needs, sorry. Maybe to smooth out cash flow between grant payments or to cover an unexpected expense. It's usually funded out of surplus revenue or from your operating margin. And it's very flexible. The board votes to use it, you can use it. An endowment, on the other hand, is about the long game. It's designed to be permanent, or at least for the very long term, and it's often set up with a donor-restricted gift or a board decision to designate funds for that purpose. Spending from an endowment is guided by policy, sometimes even by legal restrictions, and the goal is to preserve and grow those funds so they can generate income year after year. And by income, I mean taking a withdrawal from that account year after year, not literally dividends and interest. So here's how I like to frame it. A reserve helps keep you steady, but an endowment helps you grow with vision. Most healthy organizations benefit from having both. On one hand, they have the reserve, and that helps with the bumps in the road, and then the other is to help build tomorrow's foundation. So you might be thinking, okay, I get what an endowment is, that's great, but why should our organization consider starting one? And the biggest reason is sustainability of your mission. That's what matters most. Your programs, your impact, the people you serve, all of that deserves long-term support, not just year-to-year survival mode. We know that annual fundraising can sometimes be a little bit unpredictable. One cancelled event, a shift in donor behavior, a dropped grant, all these nightmare scenarios, and suddenly your budget's in question. An endowment can smooth out some of those ups and downs and give you more control over your future. It also sends a strong message to your board, to your donors, and even your staff that your organization, is thinking about the long term. It shows financial maturity and it builds trust. You're not just trying to get through the year, you're planning to be here for the next generation. And let's not overlook the very real benefit of being able to protect the programs that matter most. That when you have stable, recurring income from an endowment, it gives you the flexibility to focus on your mission. And you don't need to be a multi-million dollar institution to start taking this seriously. In fact, starting small and building over time is how most organizations do it. And we'll show you some examples of that later. So endowments are kind of this catch-all term, but let's talk about the different types of endowment funds because specifics are very important here, and you have options depending on your situation and your goals. There are typically, three main types. And the first is a donor restricted endowment. It's sometimes called a true endowment or a permanent endowment. And this is typically what you think of when people say that. This is a this is when a donor typically gives you funds and says you can invest this and spend a portion of it every year, but the intention behind this is to have it serve the organization in perpetuity. These funds are usually permanent, and your use of funds is sometimes limited by donor's instructions or for a specific purpose. A term endowment is somewhat similar, but there's usually a time or event condition where the principal is invested for a defined period of time or until a specific event occurs, after which it may be spent. Or, if permitted by the donor, it might actually be drawn down over the course of, say, 10 years to fund a particular program. And then after that, any remaining funds usually become restricted once the term ends, depending on donor intent. And then finally, we have the board designated endowment. This has all sorts of names. Some people refer to it as a quasi endowment or a board designated investment account. It's all the same thing. This is where your board sets aside part of your reserves and designates it for the long term. There's no outside restriction usually, which means that the board has total flexibility in terms of their use, their spending policy, etc., to best serve the organization. But they do need to treat these funds with the same care, strategy, and long-term outlook. And it's that last one, the board designated option, which is where many organizations start. It's flexible, it's within your control, and it's really smart way to dip your toes into the market for the first time and start investing for the future of your organization. All three types have their place, and in most cases, a nonprofit might have more than one or multiples of each type. The key here is to match the structure to your goals and be clear about the rules that come with each. Um, we actually have a real life example, and this is Megan's example about a board designated fund. So, Megan, I think you're the best person to tell the story that we have here today.
Let me take it over because I can, like I said at the beginning, I was the development director for 9 years at a domestic violence shelter. And when I first came onto the team, we had very limited revenue streams. About 60% of our revenue came from essentially two government grants. And so during my 10-year time, I really focused on diversification of our funding streams. And part of that was having conversations with leadership and our board about starting to set aside money to build an endowment. And certainly not by myself, but with our whole team at our organization, which was what I like to call a small but mighty team, a small team doing it all. And we were able to, during my time there, start to slowly set aside a small portion of funds each year that we had in surplus that was able to grow few over time. And but right after I left the organization and came over here to Carnegie looking for a career change, they did it had a lump sum where they were able to start an endowment and invest it. It started at just under $1 million, and now I'm still very much in touch with the organization, and that has grown to over $2 million now within just the past couple years. And so, while of course every situation is different, that was, I felt, a really powerful example of how even a small organization, our operating budget was only $2 million total. And so we were able to strategically set aside, sometimes the lump sums were larger than other years, but over time we were able to build that fund that now is able to help them out into the future and long term.
Yeah.
And that's what I love about now that I'm over here at Carnegie. I'm still able to help the nonprofits that are invested with us to focus on that diversification of revenue and how major donors it can support that endowment. I really enjoy that I get to do that.
I love it. I love it. Thank you, Megan. So now let's address some of the most common questions we hear when nonprofits actually start exploring endowments. The first one, how much do we need to start? Well, there's no magic number. Some set aside a portion of their surplus every year, starting small and adding over time, each quarter, each year, so on and so forth, and let it grow. What matters isn't really the size, it's more the intention. What are you looking to achieve here? You can absolutely start small and build over time. That's actually what most successful endowments actually look like we just heard. Will this lock up our cash? Well, it depends on the type of endowment. A donor-restricted endowment is going to be locked down by definition, but a board-designated fund gives you more flexibility. Your board can choose to redesignate or access it in an emergency. So if flexibility is a concern, a quasi-endowment might be the best place to start. But really, it's important to remember the difference between reserves that you do tap into and having the mindset for an endowment, which you're looking to, in most cases, leave alone and let it grow. What happens if we invest and lose money? Well, that's a real concern, and it's a smart one to raise. The key is having a prudent investment strategy that aligns with your risk horizon, with your time horizon and risk tolerance. Ultimately, the team has to go into this with the right mindset. Like I just said, this isn't a reserve account. These are funds we are setting aside for future growth, just like you do personally for retirement. Typically, your entire account won't be invested in equities in the stock market. You'll have pools set aside for different purposes. You'll have a blend of cash, fixed income, and equities so that you're able to mitigate some of that volatility and, importantly, not be a forced seller of stocks during market downturns. Investing in equities is the only way to outpace inflation over the long term, and volatility is a feature, not a bug, of investing. A good advisor will help you build a diversified portfolio with the right balance of growth and protection based on what you're looking to achieve. And if you're subject to UPMIFA, which we'll talk about in just a moment, there are legal standards about how actually to invest and spend those funds to make sure that you protect the mission and don't take unnecessary risk. So, UPMIFA. What on earth is it? Well, it stands for the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. That's a mouthful. Plain and simple, here's what you need to know. UPMIFA is a law that governs how nonprofits manage and spend endowment funds, specifically donor-restricted endowments. So if a donor establishes a fund with you, a permanent endowment, UPMIFA outlines how you need to handle that money responsibly. The law has been adopted in some form by almost every US state, so you'll need to check your state's version, and you can find a list at uniformlaws.org. In some states, it might go by a different name, like New York's, has to be different, which they call NYPMIFA. That's NYPMIFA. At the heart of this, UPMIFA is this. At the heart of UPMIFA is this. It requires prudence, purpose, and preservation. That means you manage the funds with care and diligence, you align investments and spending with the donor's intent, and you aim to preserve the purchasing power of the fund over time. It also reinforces that your board is the steward of these assets, so your board has a fiduciary duty to manage this endowment wisely. And if you're working with donor restricted funds, this is a conversation to have with, your financial advisor or legal counsel. But don't let the acronym scare you off. MIFA is here to protect your mission and help you be a good steward, not trip you up. This is also a great point for me to mention how important it is to lay the groundwork with a donor who would be looking to establish a permanent endowment from the beginning. As you establish a gift agreement with the donor, they should specify what type of endowment it is. Usually it's permanent, but maybe it's not. Maybe they are just giving it to you for, general purpose. The use of funds, that's super important. Is this for general support? Is it for scholarships? Is it for a specific program? What are the restrictions? What to do if the funds that were set aside for a program, it's something that you as an organization, you're no longer running, you're no longer supporting. What to do then? What about if the organization is no longer around or closed down, God forbid? Where to send the funds thereafter? But vitally important is the spending expectations. This is where you should chat to an advisor during this process, because if the donor desires an unreasonably high spending rate, say 7, 8, 9%, and they're not consistently contributing to this endowment year over year after their initial seeding of it, then you run the risk of actually cannibalizing your account over time. You have to make sure that the goal you're setting out to achieve is in fact achievable. So let's talk about board responsibilities while we're on this topic. Let's zoom into the board's role, because even if you have a great staff working for you, or you even retain fiduciary investment managers, your board still has that level of fiduciary responsibility for how the endowment funds are handled. If you have or you plan to build an endowment, here's what your board needs to do. They need to invest prudently. That means choosing an investment strategy that balances that growth with risk, fits your time horizon, and aligns with your mission. You're not chasing returns, and you're not reacting emotionally or irrationally to market changes. Document everything clearly. You need policies in writing. Your investment policy, spending policy, the purpose of the fund, all of that should be spelled out. It should not be something that you just guess or you have a faint idea about. In black and white is what's required. And then spend reasonably. That means having a defined approach to how much is distributed from the fund each year. Don't jeopardize the long-term value of the fund by making decisions just on a whim. And then finally, honoring donor intent. If your endowment came from a donor with restrictions, your board is responsible for making sure that those restrictions are honored in perpetuity. And that might sound like a lot, but most of it comes down to clear policies, good partners, and consistent oversight. When boards take their fiduciary role seriously, it builds trust with donors, staff, and your broader community. So now that we've walked through the basics of an endowment, let's talk about what it takes to manage an endowment responsibly. Because managing an endowment isn't just about investing wisely, it's also about accounting for it correctly, reporting transparently, and staying compliant with the rules that come with it. So to walk us through that side of the equation, I'm going to turn it over to the wonderful Sean Smith. Sean works with nonprofits every day to make sure their financials are clean, clear, and audit ready. And he's going to share with you what you need to manage your endowment responsibly. Sean, take it away.
Thank you, Chris, and wonderful to be here today. We have a great audience, and hopefully we leave you all with a lot of great education and information on what we're presenting today. With that being said, I'll get into the fun stuff, which is the accounting part, what we do at Smith CPAs and Associates. And the first item to talk about is that accounting and classification. So my comments there are: once an organization such as a nonprofit or foundation receives and manages an endowment, it incurs specific financial reporting obligations. The obligations vary based on the size of the endowment, the jurisdiction, the type of organization, and specific donor restrictions. But getting into that item of accounting and classification, endowment funds need to be properly classified and tracked in the organization's financial system and financial statements. We get a couple different categories there. Chris has spoken about one being the board designated quasi endowment being one. That is one where funds are internally set aside by the board, but without donor restrictions. The other two to mention are the permanently restricted, which are principal cannot be spent. Only the investment income can be used per the donor's intent. And then temporarily restricted are principal or earnings may be used after certain conditions are met. We have standards that we have to comply with. Chris mentioned the investment standards on the accounting and auditing side. We have the FASB, and we have what's called ASC 958 that we have to comply with when it comes to terms with endowments and reporting and disclosures. The next item that's listed there is the financial statement. So we have the statement of financial position, some refer to it as a balance sheet, that shows our net assets with and without donor restrictions. That would be right in the bottom section of the balance sheet. We have the statement of activities, which many people refer to it as an income statement or profit and loss. In the nonprofit world, we call that a statement of activities and changes in net assets. That shows our changes in endowment funds due to the investment return and also expenses associated with that endowment. Statement of cash flows is the third required financial statement. And as it applies to endowments, that may reflect contributions or withdrawals from the endowment, depending on what the specific circumstances were for the year. On to the next item, which is disclosures, detailed disclosures. That's in our footnotes of our financials. Those would include, amongst others, the nature and purpose of the endowment, our spending policy. Is it a 5% of a 3-year average market value? Not getting into a whole investment policy statement, but very brief and short, but at least disclosing in a summarized version. Also, the investment return objectives and strategies, yet again, very summarized. Changes in endowment net assets by category. So that would be permanently restricted, temporary restricted, and unrestricted, because on the face of our financial statements, there's a lot of aggregation and summarization taking place. The footnotes help us to give more of a granular perspective on what happened to take it from the beginning, the movements for the year, and then to the ending balances. Next one that we all familiar with on this call from the nonprofit space is our Form 990s. When we have an endowment, we have a special box that gets opened up where we have to comply with Schedule D. It's another form filing that comes only applicable to, there's other variables, but when there's an endowment, that's the required reporting schedule. And that details over there include the composition and use of the endowment. And I would state that with our 990 that the public transparency is always key. The filings are publicly available, both with the IRS and also with our states that regulate our nonprofits. Not every state gets into regulating, but it is 40 plus that require annual registrations, and they want to see those Form 990 filings. The next item over here to talk about is donor and grant reporting. So over there, we need annual or periodic reports that need to be provided to donors. We want to demonstrate our compliance with donor restrictions and also include our performance of our investments and how the funds were used. That's along the lines of very good and transparent donor and grant reporting. The next item that Chris mentioned, I'm not, the acronym, Chris has it, I don't, the UPMIFA. Most states have adopted it, as Chris mentioned, and it governs, as Chris pointed to, how the endowment funds may be invested and spent. Also helps to protect the purchasing power of the original gift, and provides us prudent standards for investment and spending decisions. Audit requirements, that's what we love here at Smith CPAs and Associates, to keep you compliant, give you peace of mind, and make sure that we meet our compliance requirements. But large endowments and organizations, generally based on their size, require an independent annual CPA audit. There are some criteria that vary by state. They have multiple different thresholds, but generally when these start to come into place, we have a larger asset base and a revenue base. And that's where you need to partner with your CPA to perform that annual audit. So let's then on the next one, let's talk about the required financial footnotes. First one is we need to describe that endowment and talk about the donor restrictions. Do we have board designated funds? The general use and our mission, the endowment supports. That could be scholarships, it could be programs, it could be operations. I have the nonprofits that we work with and audit. It's a variety of programs, scholarships, and grants, and certain items that they support with that endowment. And then we also want to distinguish between permanent, temporary, and unrestricted components. That's a required disclosure component. Spending policy. We want to explain that spending formula, right? What is it, a 4.5% of a 3-year rolling average? Is it a 5% of a 3-year average? Also, the we want to talk about the UPMIFA that specifically that governs the spending. Now that is dependent on the state that you operate in. And an example of what could be there is this would be an example statement. The organization has a policy of appropriating for distribution each year 5% of its endowment funds, average fair value of the prior 12 quarters. Number 3 on the list is our investment policy. We want to disclose and talk about our long-term return our expectations, our risk tolerance, diversification and asset allocation. These are items that Chris has spoken to previously, but we're just speaking in the context of what needs to land in the financial statements, and our diversification and our asset allocation. We do know that on number 4, we need to reconcile that net asset in the endowment. That's the reconciliation is on the various components, which could be without donor restrictions, with donor restrictions. And if it's in the with donor restriction category, we need to define between permanent and temporary. Let's see what we have there. Donor restrictions. What could be a donor restriction that could need to be disclosed? That could be time-based, purpose-based, what it can be used for, scholarships or research. And then also permanent. Principal must be held in perpetuity. So those are different variables that can take place with these endowments. The board designations that Chris has mentioned about, also known as a quasi-endowment, that allows an ability for some unrestricted funds to function as an endowment. And there needs to be clarity that these amounts can be redesignated by the board. That's something that we need to define in our disclosures. UPMIFA, not going to go into too much because Chris went through that, but we got to describe how that law affects us and the management of endowment funds, and that the organization considers certain factors: duration, purpose, economic conditions, and preservation of their purchasing power. And then with that being said, let's, if we could go, Megan, into the next one, which is, this is a typical, we had multiple, and just to backtrack, we could have had a workshop today on the content that's being discussed and reviewed today, but it's a very short synopsis in this hour-long webinar. But this is one of the tables that we put of multiple that need to be disclosed. And it's essentially reconciling our movements, right, from the beginning to the end of the year. How did we start? What got us there? How much did we contribute? Did we appropriate and take funds out? And then what was the investment return to get us to our ending balance? And that's what that is in a nutshell. And then I would say that in the interest of time, Megan, if we could focus on the next slide, which is our common mistakes that we want to avoid, right, when we get into having these endowments. One would be failing to distinguish the breakout, right, between our donor restrictions or board designated. And that would be also permanently restricted versus our temporarily restricted. Those misclassifications can mislead our stakeholders regarding how much of the endowment is available for immediate use and how much must be preserved into perpetuity. So how do we avoid that specific item, right? The key there is to ensure clear segregation of our net assets in the balance sheet and footnotes. And then also in our underlying general ledger and trial balance to keep those things segregated and tracked accordingly. So we're not scratching our heads at the end of the month or the quarter or the year. We've got some very solid supporting sheets to track that. And report those. We also want to be performing that detailed reconciliation of the beginning and ending balances for each class of net assets. And confidentiality, I have had clients where we're going through audits and it's done post, fiscal year end. The best practice there would be to have those done on a minimum on a quarterly basis, if not for the larger nonprofits on a monthly basis. But that way, when we get to the audit, you're just tracking your last quarterly roll, and you've had a lot of practice. You've had a lot of reps doing it. And that's just really for a disclosure purpose. It's not going to change your numbers, so to speak, but it's just a good practice to keep on top of that during. And those are management comment letters that we've shared with some of our clients that we happen to have to wait after year end for them to perform the reconciliation. So, missing required footnotes, that's another one. I mentioned misclassifying temporarily versus permanently restricted funds, lack of internal policies aligned with financial reporting. I did mention not including the reconciliation of changes in endowment assets. That's one to avoid. And then also inadequate spending policy disclosure. We don't have to go into the detail that you'd have at the granular level, but a summary, and that's where you'd work with your investment advisor, Chris and Megan at Carnegie, to assist with a summary that could be utilized for those financial statements. Now, just item to mention, those financials are the client's financials. Us as an auditor, we are coming to audit your financials, right? So technically, you own the mandatory statements, and you also own the footnotes. Now, us as a CPA firm, we do assist with drafting some of those. We can assist. And we do have advisors that can help us there to put a summary that provides the required disclosures in those financial statements. And failure to comply with UPMIFA would be another one, and lack of clarity regarding our investment returns. That's where Chris and Megan's team come in, where they help with investment policy statements and to provide financial clarity on that aspect to you when you do have an endowment fund. And I think in terms of common mistakes to avoid, along those lines is not documenting the organization's investment policy. That wouldn't happen when you're working with trusted advisors such as Chris and Megan, who will assist you to have those in place and have the required reviews and revisit those from time to time. And then one key one that's not on the list is omitting footnotes on related party transactions, right? So that would be something that needs to be disclosed in the footnotes when it happens to be. And I would say at that point in time, Megan, I don't have anything further to add in terms of the mistakes to avoid in terms of reporting and presenting those financials when you have an endowment in place.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Sean. And yeah, you're right. The financial reporting side can feel a little bit heavy. But as you know, having the right systems in place and clear documentation matters so much when it comes to managing your funds overall, outside of even the investment sphere and things. And having it done in a proper way makes it so much more manageable. Let's come back up to the surface for a moment just to talk about how to actually get started. Because whether or not you're ready to open an investment account tomorrow or not, there are 3 steps that you can start laying the foundation today. Step 1 is to get clear on your why. Why are you trying to protect or sustain for the long term? Maybe it's core programming, maybe it's staffing stability, or your ability to respond in a crisis. The clearer your why, the easier it is to make good decisions about structure, fundraising, and messaging down the line. Step 2 is to actually start that board conversation. You don't need a fully developed proposal, don't worry, but just opening the conversation, focusing on those values, not just the dollars. Asking, What would it mean for our organization to think beyond year-on-year survival? Maybe it's the right time, maybe it's not. But that question alone can help spark some of that powerful dialogue. And the third is to choose the right type of fund. Will you be building towards a lump sum to invest or nurturing a potential major donor for a restricted gift? Or maybe it starts with a simple board designation of funds that you already have. The structure should fit your reality and not the other way around. And remember, it's absolutely okay to start small. Small and steady compounds over time. I always like to say that anything above zero compounds. That's how most endowments begin. So what comes next? So things to think about in terms of building it, building something to last. It's putting key policies in place, and that means your investment policy statement, or IPS, which usually contains a spending policy inside there as well, and a clear statement of purpose for the fund. These aren't just best practices, they're essential tools to make sure that you keep your board aligned and to ensure that there's donor confidence. And if you're not sure where to start, we'll share some free on-demand webinars to talk you through exactly how to draft one of these. The second one is to open up a dedicated investment account. We always like to point people towards Fidelity or towards Schwab just because they're amazing, ultra low cost custodians. They're the best people to, help you serve you as a custodian, not exactly as an advisor, but as a custodian to actually house those funds for you. And this, opening up the dedicated account helps keep the funds separate from operating cash, which makes it easier to track, easier to report, and easier to manage according to policy. It's all about helping to reinforce the mindset that this is a long-term asset for the organization. And then finally, seed it. Oh, actually, step 3 is to seed it. Maybe it's a board gift, maybe it's a portion of this year's surplus, maybe it's a donor steps forward with a request. However you want to start, the key is to make it official and intentional. It's the planting of the tree. And if you're wondering, where do we actually find that seed money? You're not alone. Don't worry. That's our next webinar coming up in August. That's going to be run by the wonderful Megan Lenkowski, our host today, all about how to fund your endowment. And we'll walk through ideas there for both board designated and donor restricted funds to help you think creatively about how to begin to build momentum, even if starting from scratch. The fourth step is to grow over time. Mention your endowment in major giving conversations. Use it wisely in line with your spending policy. Invest it with care and purpose. This is where momentum builds. You don't need to have it all figured out today, but you do need to take that first step. And everything we've shared with you today is designed to help you do that. You don't have to do it alone. Your advisor, if you are working with one currently, should be taking this administrative burden off your shoulders and managing as both a governing fiduciary and a managing fiduciary to ensure that everything is both set up properly and managed accordingly. And with that, I'll pass it over to Megan so that we can open it up for Q&A.
Wow. Thank you so much, Chris and Sean, for all of those insights. I know I put it in the chat, but we have obviously gone a little bit over our time today, but that is fine. We are here to provide value for you guys. We see most of you are all still on, and so we can tell that you're definitely getting a lot from this. So we won't spend too much time on Q&A since we are a little over. There were 2 questions that I wanted to address. One, somebody asked, Chris kept mentioning the word surplus. What does that mean? I'm happy to cover that. Essentially, that surplus is the additional money, the revenue that you've gathered over the year, in addition to your operating expenses. So the bare minimum expenses that you have to pay out throughout the year. And then sometimes, not all the time in nonprofits, I know that, but sometimes, and especially with intention and the idea that you want to set a certain amount aside, there you're able to raise a little bit more than covering, your actual expenses for the year. So that surplus, that money that is not already spoken for for an expense, it has that flexibility for nonprofits, for the board to be able to set aside, and invest in their quasi endowment. And the one other question, Sean, that I wanted to mention was for you. It says could you clarify a little more on the significance of the footnotes? They sound like they are critically important and not simply details to be added as a courtesy. Is that right?
Yes, thank you, Megan. They definitely are play a critical role in providing transparency, context, and compliance with accounting standards. So they're not a courtesy; they are mandatory and required. And I would say just a couple of pointers is they're hitting the area of clarification of financial items. Number one, number two, that's compliance with GAAP requirements, right? To have an audit and had to have GAAP based financials. And then I would say that there's also a third one, which is the legal and donor obligation transparency. Number four would be our risk disclosure and investment management. And number five would be along the lines of stewardship and accountability. So that's what I would say. There's 5 pointers, and that's the answer in terms of the disclosures that are required when we have endowments.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing that. Again, we know that the accounting and financial side can feel a bit overwhelming. And like Sean mentioned, he could have had a whole day workshop teaching everybody about this. So we encourage, if you have specific questions, I will include Sean's kind of email in the resources afterwards. So please feel free to reach out to Sean directly if you have further questions. All right, so we are at the end of our session. We are so grateful that all of you joined us today.
We actually got one more in from Stephen, which we could
Oh,
tackle. We got time for one more. We got time for
perfect.
one more. I'll answer. So Stephen says, would donors be okay with endowment funds being flexible, meaning what is earned yearly beyond the principal? Is it okay for those funds to be either reinvested in the endowment or used for general operating? Trying to infer from that question, um, it depends on the style of endowment. So a donor restricted endowment is set up for a particular purpose, and when it is created, you have in there an agreement in terms of how much you're looking to be spending out of that fund year on year. And typically, it's regardless we're spending, say 4%, 5% of that, that trailing 3-year market value in a given year. So it's designated for a particular purpose. Whereas with a board designated endowment with a board designated investment account, the board typically has a lot of flexibility of what they do there. People make donations to the organization to be put to best use. It might be the case that they're saving up for um, for a particular project. Maybe they want to make an extension onto their facility, and so they're investing those funds out. The investment policy statement is going to contain within there what the spending policy is and how much flexibility they have with that given year on year. We see a lot of cases where it's we want to invest in the future, but we want to set up our allocation in a way that if we want to start drawing on it, we can. Really, it's just making sure that you have the correct governance documents in place and you're clear on the reasons for why you're investing these funds so that if donors are savvy enough to look through these documents and ask you about them, you're able to answer that with complete confidence. So I hope that answers your question. And if not, shoot us a message.
I think one thing just that I would add to that, Chris, is on the donor side, from the question, would donors be okay with that flexibility? I think one of the most important things, and like Chris mentioned earlier on, is those initial conversations that you're having with the donor and that donor gift agreement. That is really going to lead the how you're going to be using that fund and managing it. And there are certainly donors who are more than willing to have their even if it's a donor restricted endowment, having that be flexible. There are certainly donors who are more than willing to donate. Actually, we work with an organization who they are in the process of having those conversations with their donor about changing what the donor what those funds could be used for. And so really having those conversations at the beginning with the donor and just being on the same page, I think is very critically important. And to answer the question is that yes, there are definitely donors who are more than happy to have their donation be flexible for you to use, especially when you're able to explain to the donor some of those different scenarios of when their gift can be really the most impactful for your organization.
Sorry to interrupt you earlier, Megan. I just thought
No,
since we're all
big.
here, we might as well answer it. So
I'm
take
glad.
it away, please.
Yes. So for our next webinar that we have coming up on August 20th, it's really a part 2 to this webinar. I haven't actually titled it part 2, but really it's going to be, how do you actually fund your endowment? Now that you know all the basics, you can understand for your organization what type of endowment you want, how you're going to be able to manage it, what partners you're going to need to assist you and support you. And then where do we get this seed money? And I'm going to be walking through a few tactics for both a quasi board designated endowment, as well also as ways to work with donors and attract major gifts such as stock donations and bequests. So feel free, or please keep an eye on your inbox. All of this information will be coming your way. I also will be sharing some of the resources that Chris has talked about today. If you heard the investment policy statement or spending policy or MIFA and is like, those words make me scared, I get it, because they used to me as well. But we have some great resources that I'm going to share as well, so you can dive deeper into that if needed. So I want to thank everybody one more time for joining, for staying on with us longer and listening to us talk. We hope you got a lot of value out of today, and please reach out to us if you guys have any questions.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.